Middle East. It's been a year now since Arab tyrants began to topple. For many decades, those of us who worked on the Middle East have known that this is a region that has become a byword for political immobility and for repression. It's a region that was renowned for the stability of its undemocratic systems. Until 2011, there had not been real regime change in a single Arab country for more than 40 years, and most countries in the region, in fact, had systems that were unmodified for much longer than 40 years. Today, I've argued elsewhere that we're today facing a juncture that's unprecedented in modern history. Regimes that seem to be very firmly entrenched are clearly vulnerable all over the Arab world. The autocrats in Tunisia and Egypt disappeared after popular revolutions of several weeks. 2 others fell thereafter in much more complicated circumstances in Yemen and Libya, and the autocrat in Damascus is currently fighting to retain control. Meanwhile, other Arab rulers who have not yet been overthrown are forced to make concessions to their people. They're suddenly energized. Citizenry are making demands, and a frozen political situation in some of these countries that seemed immovable has just melted overnight in the wake of these upheavals. Something that is less visible is the fact that confronting these revolutionary waves is a well-financed, absolutist, monarchical, anti-democratic counter-revolution. This is a very powerful movement. It exploits religion as a banner, but its main thrust is visceral opposition to the idea of popular representation. It reminds me, and many other historians, I think, of nothing so much as the Holy Alliance, which developed in Europe to oppose the French Revolution, and all of its sequels, every democratic, every constitutional movement in Europe for decades was opposed by the Habsburgs, by the Romanovs, and so forth. I think we're all privileged to be experiencing this as historians, to be watching this kind of thing take place before our eyes. I think it is really a world historical moment. I also think, and this applies very much, I think, to ordinary citizens in our country, I think that what happened since a young man set himself on fire in a small town in western Tunisia in December of 2010 shows how false were all of those analyses which described the supposed passivity of the Arabs in the face of their despotic regimes. These were upheavals that began with ordinary people, in every case, even where the revolutions turned more violent. They began with ordinary people peacefully demanding freedom, dignity, democracy, social justice, transparency, the rule of law, and so forth. Arabs who had been othered and turned into exotic beasts by the media, Arabs at the end of the day turned out to have hopes and ideals that were exactly the same as those that drove people in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia or any one of the many regions in the world which have managed to carry out democratic transitions. This was probably a surprise to a lot of people, in particular to those who had taken in the media's reductionist view of the Arabs, and were also, I think, fooled by its single-minded focus on Islamic fundamentalism and on terrorism, which is almost the only thing that you could hear about when the media rarely dealt with the Middle East. Even after 9/11, when there was a huge amount of coverage, there was very little coverage of what ordinary people felt. Now, it's important, I think, to stress that for the importance of all of these upheavals, to date, nothing has been decided in any of the Arab countries that have witnessed these remarkable changes. It's very clear that in every case, the hardest job is yet to come. I spent some time in Cairo over 3 different visits last year and a number of other Arab capitals. I know from talking to Juan Cole that he has had some even more extensive time in the Middle East in the last year. And it's really clear that even in the 4 countries where dictators have fallen, the process of thoroughly changing regimes, the process of building sustainable, stable democratic systems has only just begun. The army is still a center of power in Egypt and Yemen. There is no question that its position has been untouched as of this point in time. Probably in Egypt it's been forced to make compromises, but the institutional position of the army is as yet unquestioned. And in Yemen, the army is still there, with all the power that it had before. The president's no longer Ali Abdel Saleh, who was an army commander, but still. In Libya, there's a situation of chaos, division, tribal and regional problems, and many other problems. Tunisia, which is in many ways in the best shape of the four, is still being destabilized by a tiny minority of radical Salafis, Salafis being people who uphold an extreme version of Islam. These people are financed indirectly from abroad. In the case of Tunisia, in a clearly transparent democratic election, they got no support whatsoever. Nevertheless, they're raising holy hell in the universities and elsewhere. They have no support, they got no votes, they have no mass base, and yet they're making a complete nuisance of themselves, more than a nuisance. I don't know if Juan's going to be able to address this. Clearly, whenever democratic systems, sustainable and stable democratic systems can be established in their country, in these countries, other problems will arise. The first problem, I think, the most important, is that there's no guarantee that a democratic system will not be dominated by the kind of entrenched, powerful, moneyed interests to which no democracy is immune. I mean, we certainly know all about this in our country. Just look at the front page of the New York Times this morning. Check of $1 million, you can see the president. Check of $1 million, you can see Romney. You and I can't see the president or Romney, obviously, unless any of you have $1 million checks. Most importantly, I think, on the social front, it's going to be very hard for any new popular democratic Arab regime to achieve the social justice and the rapid economic growth that are going to be desperately needed in order to provide equal opportunity, quality education, good jobs, decent housing, and infrastructure to populations that really, really are in need of these things. And the absence of these things, the failure of the old regimes to provide these things, I think is one of the reasons that we've had this revolution. My talk has a bunch of statistics about Egypt in particular. Let me just throw some of them at you very quickly. Just as evidence of how the regime in Egypt, which was seen so very positively both by Washington and by the international financial community, was actually faring before the revolution. The number of Egyptians living on under $2 a day went up from 39% to 43%. I was told that this is actually an old statistic. The number is closer to 45 or 46% of the population during Mubarak's last 10 or 11 years in power. Wages as a share of national income went down from 30% to 25% in the same period. That meant that the rest was being siphoned off for something else than wages, which means that the entire population of Egypt was getting 25% of its GDP. All of this was taking place during an era of what the Egyptians call infitah, opening up, starting with Sadat, open markets, infusion of foreign investment, skyrocketing profits for foreign companies and Egyptian companies. An Egyptian stock market which is still rising. It's been rising for more than since it was opened, really. A vastly wider gulf between the extremely rich and the rest of society, not just the poor, but also the middle classes who are being ground down. Now this was very well regarded in some quarters. Egypt was seen as having a 6% annual GDP, higher than its population growth rate, and it was seen as a model by AID, the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions of the neoliberal global economic consensus. I'm arguing, one of the things I would argue, is that one of the things these revolutions represent has been a protest against this neoliberal world order and the free trade market fundamentalist dogma which underpins it. In most of these countries, among the elites, this doctrine, this free market doctrine, has attained the status of economic gospel. They loved it. As far as they were concerned, it was a very, very good thing. And they have been leading the way in many of these countries, including countries like Syria and others, not just Egypt, with the privatization of the public sector, with shredding the social safety net, with cutting subsidies. Mubarak cut subsidies for food by 50% in the time he was in power. And other things that you just need to go to Wisconsin to see these things. What happens to unions here is what was happening to unions there. What's happening in terms of forced productivity growth, decrease in wages as a proportion of income, these are the things that are happening there. It's the same global order. I think that this poses a problem for these new revolutionary regimes, because I think that one of the objectives of people rising up, whether they fully understood it or not, and in some cases they were very articulate about it, one of their objectives was to stop the rush in this direction. It's going to be very difficult for new democratic governments, whenever they're finally stable in these countries, to fulfill their people's economic and social aspirations, while at the same time avoiding alienating the United States and the countries of the global north. These are countries that are going to have to be courted in order to get investment. And I will tell you something that is very clear to me. The United States and other European and Western northern countries may or may not oppose democracy per se. In the past, the United States has been generally unfavorable to democracy in the Arab world. But they will react strongly to any challenge to the current neoliberal world economic order. Freedom, when the United States exports it, may or may not mean democracy. In the Arab world, it has not meant democracy. What it has meant has been freedom of movement for capital, freedom of movement in terms of repatriation of profits, free trade, minimal restrictions on private enterprise. That's what freedom means when the United States implements it. At least it's what it has meant in the Arab world. And there are forces in these societies, not just the old elites, that are favorable to this message in both Egypt and in Tunisia. The parties that have done the best in the elections, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Ennahda party in Tunisia, are deeply committed to the capitalist system and to the free market. They include leaders who are big businessmen themselves. Khairat al-Shatteh, who was just disqualified as a presidential candidate in Egypt a few days ago, is one of the biggest businessmen, not one of the biggest, but one of the, is a very major figure in the business community. He's one of the top leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. The ideas that these parties have for social justice, which is an important element in their program, are rooted in charity and in voluntary effort, rather than in redistribution of wealth via a vigorous state sector. Not surprisingly, our government has been approving of changes in both Egypt and Tunisia, because in both of these countries, they're reassured about what will happen in terms of economy and social structure. If new democratic governments fail to meet popular social and economic aspirations, such a failure is going to be exploited by this reactionary coalition that I've talked about. They're already involved in all of these countries, led by the Saudis, buying up politicians, creating political parties, limiting democratization wherever that's possible, and where the old regimes are still in power, shoring them up with their unlimited funds. And with the price of oil over $100, their funds are even more unlimited. That's a problem. And in Egypt, where I happened to be during the second round of the parliamentary elections, I was shocked by the fact that it wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't the liberal parties, it wasn't even the old Wafd party, which actually did well in the elections, a party that's been around since 1919. It was Hizb an-Nur, a party that didn't exist 6 months ago, that had the most widespread electoral propaganda in the towns and cities and villages that I went through during a day when I was traveling around, on the day of the election. These people had the country plastered with what I think were tens of millions of dollars worth of electoral propaganda. They didn't collect that, by donations in the street. They were getting big checks from probably Saudi Arabia. At least that's what the Egyptian state prosecutor says, because there are charges against the party for financing. That's one problem. Another problem is that real failure by any of these new regimes could also open the way for the kind of violent minority trends that prosper in this region when there are conditions of chaos and disorder. We saw that happen after we invaded Iraq in 2003 and destroyed the Iraqi state and created a situation of anarchy and civil war. Such forces were unleashed in Iraq. We can see such forces at work today in Yemen and in Libya and in other parts of the region. Finally, another problem that these regimes will face is the fact that this is the Middle East. This is a region which, because of its strategic position, because of its energy reserves, is the most coveted region in the world. It's the most important region in the world strategically, given the fact it's a crossroads and given these incredible energy reserves. As a result, it is the most penetrated by foreign interest. Anyone who worked on Latin America might say, no, Latin America is more penetrated. Anyway, it's one of the most penetrated. As a result, it is a region that is vulnerable, as it has been throughout its long history, and this is, of course, where history began. So you go back to the time of the pharaohs, and you'll see that this was true then. It's still true now. It's been vulnerable ever since history began to external intervention that could easily divert or distort outcomes. In other words, the results of these revolutions may not be determined by internal causes. They may be determined by completely exogenous causes like a war with Iran, for example. That could skew everything. I'm arguing in the talk that I'm going to abbreviate a little bit to give us more time to discuss things, that the reason that these revolutions are unprecedented is not just because they were democratic. That's not new. It's not just because they were peaceful. That's also not new. They started peaceful. I argue in this talk that, in fact, what's new about these upheavals is that they mark the end of the phase of dealing with colonialism and the beginning of a phase of dealing with internal problems of this region. I think this is very important. Every part of the Arab world, with one exception, has now completed the phase of liberation from foreign occupation, foreign control, and these revolutions just didn't deal with those issues. Finally, that's done with. And finally, issues of governance, issues of social justice, constitutions, democracy, and so forth are at the forefront. The only part of the Arab world where occupation and foreign control is still the problem is obviously occupied Palestine, the occupied Palestinian territories. It's the only exception. And in fact, that's why the Palestinians are in such a quandary. They have the same problems of bad governance that everybody else in the Arab world has, plus the old problem of occupation and external rule and having foreign power dominate them. What distinguishes these revolutions, therefore, is that this is the end of this. It marks that the fact that we're completely done with the phase of national liberation, and we've begun a new phase, a new era, with largely inward-directed movements focusing on the problems of society and problems of governance. I argue in this talk that these revolutions had a number of demands. Some of them obviously were social, many of them were simply political democracy. But they were also directed at achieving dignity for the population. This meant in the first instance individual dignity. And it's very easy to understand why there was such a demand for individual dignity in the face of the kind of authoritarian police states that existed in that region, which crushed the individual and treated people as if they were not adults. And you just needed to listen to Mubarak's speeches, or you just need to listen to Assad's speeches to see the kind of autocratic attitude. We know better than the people what's necessary. Shut up, you little children. We will do what's necessary. In the face of that kind of rhetoric, demand for individual dignity is understandable. There was another demand that was being raised, however, and this was a demand for collective dignity. And it brings us to the role of the dominating role of the United States. This has not been reported on a great deal. It was always in the background. It wasn't the main focus of these revolutions. But everybody in the Arab world knew that their governments were benefiting from police training, from intelligence training, from shipments of tear gas, the tear gas that was used in Tahrir Square, the tear gas that was used in Tunis, like the tear gas that's used against peaceful demonstrations in the West Bank, is American tear gas, shipped from plants in Pennsylvania, actually. Everybody in the region knows this. The dictators were on excellent terms with Western intelligence services. The United States outsourced torture to a broad range of Middle Eastern states: Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. These were places where we had people tortured because we can't do it ourselves by our own laws. What people understand in the region is that the United States, when it talked about the Western powers, when it talked about stability, really meant keeping the status quo in place, keeping regimes that were repressive and corrupt and that frustrated popular demands in place. It also meant subordination of their weak, pliable governments, which all lacked legitimacy, the subordination of their governments to the dictates of U.S. policy. The call for collective dignity is a call to end this unnatural situation, and this clearly poses a problem. I think that these upheavals raise a whole bunch of questions, none of which I'm really going to be able to answer in the remaining, we have about 15 minutes, less. I've touched on some of them, whether this spirit of liberation can be sustained in the face of counter-revolution, whether the regimes that will emerge can deal with the socioeconomic problems, the kinds of ones that I touched on, whether the Arabs will be able to establish viable new political systems, or whether they're going to end up with modified versions of what they had before. In Egypt, there is an incredibly interesting struggle going on between the old regime, personified by the army, which wants to maintain a presidential system, wants to maintain as much as possible of an executive completely unanswerable to anybody, which will control the military, which will be in partnership with the military, whose prerogatives, whose control of maybe a third of the economy will be unquestionable, whose budget will be secret. This is a struggle for the soul of Egypt, really. And anybody who's gone back over Egyptian history, looked at the creation of the modern Egyptian state 200 years ago, will see that this is not a new issue. Each of these countries is going to have these kinds of issues come up. In all of these cases, what we're going to see, in the first instance, I think, dominating a newly democratic landscape, is going to be Islamist parties. And the reason for this is very simple. I was talking to Juan about this. I think we agree on this. It's not just because many people are pious in these societies. That's part of it. It's because they really think everybody else, all the secular politicians, are crooks. And they think that people who are pious might just be less crooked. I heard this again and again from ordinary people in Egypt. He's a believer, therefore he's probably not a thief. And they didn't say it in exactly those terms, but that's what they meant. And that is why you had people who were secularists. That's why my son was living in Bethlehem during the Palestinian elections. All of his Christian neighbors voted for Hamas. They weren't Islamists. They weren't even Muslims. They were voting for people they thought might not be crooks, might not be thieves. And it was very, very, very simple. And that's the case. That has been the case in Tunis, and it has been the case in Egypt. The other question that I, again, can't answer is, will what started in the countries that have seen the beginnings of major change, will that continue to the other Arab countries? For all the similarities between them, each Arab country is very, very different from others. It's all well and good to talk about Pan-Arabism and how there's a common language, which there is, there's a common public space, which there is, but there are very different nation states and very different polities that have developed over the last century or so. The people in many of these countries are much less demographically homogenous than are the Tunisians or than are the Egyptians. I could go into the details. I don't think I need to here. It's clear, however, that in spite of all of this, something new has started in this region. You can see, watching satellite television, which I do a lot, Arabic satellite television, that there are common aspirations all over this region for change. There is a common Pan-Arab sphere. There's been an excessive focus, I think, on the technology and a failure to understand that this common Pan-Arab sphere existed long, long ago. I worked on the late 19th and early 20th century, and the press created this common Pan-Arab sphere a century ago. Other much earlier technological radio helped to sustain it. Television before satellite television did the same thing. And what may have changed is that new technological means like satellite television and cell phones were linked to non-hierarchical network-type forms of organization, which were what were behind all of these revolutions. These were not led by hierarchical, pyramidal political parties, which is what the secret police were looking for. Secret police could not figure out what was going on because the things that they were taught were the most danger to their rulers were not there. Non-hierarchical network-type forms of organization are what overthrew each of these regimes. The last question that these revolutions raise is the role of the United States. And I want to come back to this and conclude with it. There's a long and really quite unedifying history of American support for absolute rulers across this region, as long as they allowed U.S. military bases or access to the U.S. military, as long as they provided oil resources on American terms as much as possible, as long as they plowed back their oil revenues into the U.S. and Western economies, and as long as they were subservient to Israel and otherwise did exactly what was wanted of them by Washington. Washington was thrilled to have governments that had no domestic legitimacy and didn't have a public opinion or parliaments which anchored them to positions that were inimical to the positions Washington wanted them to take. If you watch, I've been rereading Kissinger's memoirs, he would go to Israel and the Prime Minister would say to him, Mr. Secretary, I have a Knesset to answer to. These people won't let me do this. I have a cabinet. I will lose my job. The government will fall. You'll have nobody to talk to. Now, Anwar Sadat and Hafez al-Assad couldn't say that to the Secretary of State. It wasn't true. They were absolute dictators. They could do anything they wanted. They did have public opinion. It is a completely different ballgame to have a representative government to deal with The United States found this out in Turkey when it tried to use Turkey as a pass-through for American military forces to be used in the invasion of Iraq. The Turkish government was willing, the military was thrilled. Parliament wouldn't go along. End of discussion. The United States didn't use Turkey. They sent stuff through the Suez Canal by expedited shipments because the Mubarak government was perfectly willing to oblige. Public opinion was against the war, but that didn't matter. In Turkey it did. So this is an important question, I think. In this country, as any of you who work on U.S. foreign policy know, we are torn between our principles, things like support for democracy, and what we are told are our interests, including, in many cases in the Middle East, upholding dictators who support supposed American strategic aims. When the public doesn't pay attention, as is usually the case in foreign affairs in this country, it is those interests that the policymakers pay attention to rather than American ideals. And that's been most of the time the case in the Middle East. American public opinion was paying a lot more attention to the Middle East over the past 18 months, or 15 or 16 months. And as a result, policy was forced to take into account the fact that Americans didn't want to see us supporting dictators. Americans didn't want to see this country opposing democratic revolutions. However, when public opinion about the Middle East turns its attention away, when it falls back onto stereotypes that the media continues to feed it, there's a likelihood that things there might change. And I think that the verbal support that our government has given to democracy in this region may diminish when attention wanes. And at that point, policymakers will go back to realpolitik. They will be enabled in so doing by the mystification which is produced by things like talking about advancing democracy when you're actually not doing so, or talking about humanitarian intervention. These are twin cloaks for a number of sins that have been committed all over the world. The so-called R2P, responsibility to protect, quite frequently cloaks all kinds of sinister interests, not just in the Middle East. I think, however, that what has happened in the Middle East is going to make that old realpolitik, business as usual approach much, much harder. Because of the pivotal geopolitical importance of Egypt throughout recorded history, the demise of Mubarak has caused deep concern to all the status quo states in the Middle East, whether the United States and Israel or Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies. With Mubarak's disappearance, all of these countries have lost an irreplaceable regional asset in terms of keeping things the way they were and cementing their regional ascendancy. The fall of Mubarak removed a pillar of American policy since the days of Kissinger, when the United States helped to shift Egypt from the Soviet to the American colony under Anwar Sadat. If you just look at the changes in the Palestinian arena, I won't go through them, the fall of Mubarak has been revolutionary in terms of changing things among the Palestinians. I would talk about these things if you're interested, but I'm going to skip them. I would stress, however, that in Egypt, American core interests are still largely in place. Those core interests are really three. The first is a close relationship with the Egyptian military and the continuation of a strategic alliance. The second is obviously the peace treaty with Israel, and the third is Egypt staying wedded to a neoliberal economic model. The United States has lots of means of influencing outcomes in Egypt. But my point is, in this era of growing populism, mass politics, and elections, it's much, much harder for the United States to do this. I have never seen the level of freedom of speech and free public discourse in Egypt that I found in my trips there last year. This constrains very much what the United States, Saudis, and others interested in the status quo can do. This is a fluid situation. It's wide open. Nothing has been decided in terms of how Egypt is going to be governed in the future. The Constitution hasn't been established. The role of the military hasn't been clarified. Whether the executive or parliament will dominate, none of these things have been clarified. And so it's very difficult for the United States to control outcomes. I think the peace treaty is likely, in fact, certain to survive. Most Arabs have no desire for war with Israel. Most Egyptians have no desire whatsoever for war with Israel. All the Arab states together, if they ever were able to get together and coordinate, couldn't stand up to Israel's military in a conventional war. And in Egypt, there is no serious political force that's calling for an abrogation of the peace treaty, so it's simply not going to happen. There are demands for modifications to this treaty, which is seen as infringing on certain aspects of Egyptian sovereignty. And there are certainly demands for renegotiation or cancellation of the gas deal, which was a bonanza for Israel, the prices that they got. But on the other hand, while there's no desire for war and no likelihood of the treaty being abrogated, there is a demand in Egypt and in other Arab countries, a popular demand for justice for the Palestinians and strong opposition to normalization with Israel before such justice is achieved. At Madrid in 1991, Secretary Baker and President Bush sold the Arabs a bill of goods. You normalize, and sooner or later the Palestinians will be okay. Well, 20 years ago, sooner or later has not come, and most of the Arab countries correctly believe that they were snookered. They've normalized relations with a country that's oppressing their fellow Arabs, and they don't like that. That doesn't mean they're going to do anything about it, but they will certainly make a fuss in terms of saying we won't further normalize. And public opinion in Egypt and most Arab countries is very much against normalization for this reason. If Israel had gone ahead with what was understood to be happening in the early 90s, you would not have this problem. I would argue, as a result of all of these changes, that Washington can no longer rely indefinitely on the kind of servility towards the United States that the Arab regimes have shown. Thoroughgoing regime change is only beginning, but this, I think, has already changed. In my talk, I'm going to skip this section. In my talk, I had a little bit about how much changes in Egypt and in Syria, for that matter, have already led to changes in the Palestinian arena. I talk about that at great length. The Palestinians have gone along now for 2 decades with a so-called peace process, which did not really bring them peace. I think you can see that. What it did was to bring the reinforcement of the occupation and a tripling of the settler population since 1991 in the occupied West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem. I would point out that this peace process, so-called, provided wonderful careers for many American diplomats. In the project I'm working on, I came upon a remark of James Baker's to Aaron David Miller, who's one of the chief officials who was a peace processor with Dennis Ross and several others. And Baker said to, I can't even imitate Baker's Texas accent, but I'll just say what he said. This is a direct quote. I want you to know, Aaron, if I had another life, I would want to be a Middle East specialist just like you, because it would mean guaranteed permanent employment. That's what the peace process has done. It's brought misery to the Palestinians, but it's gotten wonderful careers for a bunch of American diplomats. I think it's clear that the remaining absolute Arab rulers, even if they manage to stay in power, will have much more difficulty ignoring the wishes of the people. They have submissively followed Washington's lead, for example, in its Cold War on Iran, or in giving a pass where Israel is concerned. These are unpopular policies. They're going to be much harder to defend in the face of an energized public, free press, and an aggressive street. In all of the Arab countries, I think, this is going to be a bigger problem. It'll be much more difficult for Arab rulers to ignore their own domestic public opinion and blindly follow unpopular policies. Let me conclude. Since World War II, the United States has done more than any external power to shape the Middle East through its oil concessions, actually going back before World War II, 1930s in Saudi Arabia, through its military bases, through its economic might, through its unstinting support of Israel, and through its wars in the region and around the region. More recently, I think, in the last decade or so, the United States probably affected the Arab region more than it affected any other region in the world, the war in Iraq, for example. But the rise globally of new powers, of more democratic governments, of new regional configurations, combined with the grave economic crisis that the whole world is going through, means that we may be facing a new conjuncture. If an outcome of these uprisings in the Arab world is governments that are more responsive to the wishes of their people, and the governments that were in place couldn't have been less responsive to the wishes of their people, and if this region can show even a modicum of regional collaboration as compared with the venomous inter-Arab politics of the past, interesting changes, not just in the Arab order, but in the global order, may be in the offing. I'll give you a couple of examples. Imagine what it would be like if one family did not control the resources of major oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or the Gulf Principalities. Imagine what it would be like if there were not unlimited funding, absolutely unlimited funding, for the most retrograde and fanatical religious tendencies of the Islamic world. I mean, these are important changes. Imagine what it would be like if narrowly based on democratic regimes weren't squabbling with one another, and inter-Arab relations showed a little more comedy, or if Arab-Turkish relations, or Arab-Kurdish relations, or even Arab-Iranian relations were not so venomous. Clearly, none of these things is guaranteed. None of them is even necessarily likely to happen. Many, many factors militate against their occurring. But if some of them do happen, this would have an enormous impact, I would argue, on relations between America and the Arabs. And it would mark one of the first times in a long time that the Arabs would have any significant agency in their relationship with the United States. It is the Arab revolts that have made it possible even to consider such possibilities, which were unimaginable 12 or 15 months ago. These revolts have changed the potentialities not only for the Arab world, but I think also for the position of the United States, the greatest power of this age, within this most strategically important region in the world. This is why I think all of us should consider the possibility that much, much more rides on these Arab revolts than just the fate of the Arabs. Thank you very much.